Welcome everyone. Glad to see you on my channel. Today I will tell you about an unusual story, an amazing story about companionship and love. I wish you a pleasant audience. Angela took a deep breath and took the first step from behind the walls of the penal colony. The area around was rather abandoned, dreary. The prison was at a distance from the city, at the very edge of a wooded area. A high fence with barbed wire and powerful floodlights surrounded the grim buildings on all sides. From the entrance, a few barracks where prisoners lived and a deserted yard for walks could be discerned. Behind the fence, there was practically no greenery. The land looked abandoned. Behind the girl was a huge gate where two thundering guards stood at the entrance, controlling the entrance and exit of the prisoners from the colony. The entire perimeter was covered with bars. The guards rotated every 4 hours and made their rounds of the territory. There were practically no people around the colony, which is not surprising. The place was completely cut off from the rest of the world. In Angela's memory, this desert of loneliness remained forever as a refuge of horror and injustice, where she never wanted to return after her long-awaited release. Far ahead, she saw a bus stop, the only link to civilized society. Angela walked toward it, overwhelmed with mixed feelings. On the one hand, she was greatly relieved that she was finally free after several years behind bars. On the other hand, the woman was filled with fear and uncertainty about what would happen to her next. Angela had to carefully control every step so that she would not fall and soil the only decent clothes she had left. She had nowhere to hurry, though. Not a single person was to be seen at the bus stop, and the schedule was a mystery. Maybe the bus ran twice a day. No one would care about the comfort of ex-convicts after all. If someone from a past life could look at Angela now, they would notice how she had changed since then. Her face had become considerably thinner and paler, and her eyes were much darker and more wary. Her hair was short, and there were many scars and scratches visible on her skin, indicative of the brutality of the colony. But despite her misfortunes, Angela remained a beautiful woman. Her eyes were deep and passionate, and her figure still made men look at her with fascination. True, now the former prisoner was not up to appearance. He thought intensely about his plans for the future. After all, the deceased term had not set all the problems. In total, Angela served 5 years. The unfortunate incriminated her for the murder of her own husband, with whom they had not lived long. The story was horrible, still making her shudder with chills at the recollection. It was like a nightmare dream, only it was real. William's husband had indeed been murdered right in front of her eyes. The young couple's home had been broken into by the man's competitors, who had failed to agree on business matters. A few days before, William had actually told his wife about some bandits who were breaking down anyone who opposed them. The criminals were demanding a share of the sales or part of the business, to which the husband responded with a firm refusal. In the end, a small, completely inconspicuous business was the cause of such a brutal massacre. Angela could not stand it and furtively waved an incoming tear. There was no one at the bus stop and no one around, but it was still embarrassing for her to cry, standing right there in the street like that. She remembered how much effort it had taken to build what little they had. The tiny company had survived solely on loans and other donations from caring co-founders. They worked, barely breaking even with the squeaky clean buying businesses. William would have been happy to pay the thugs, but there was barely enough money to pay the thugs, but there was barely enough money to pay the workers and buy the necessities. The first time their office was visited peacefully. Solid lawyers in expensive suits paid a courtesy visit to talk culturally and explain that it wasn't just income tax to work in the area. William threw them out in a rage, shouting that he could barely manage to pay his debts. The lawyers did not cause a scandal, just a strained smile, a shrug of the shoulders, and disappeared without a trace. But to forget about the incident as easily did not work. That same night, less polite guys broke into the young couple's house and explained that the businessman, in fact, had no choice. To prove the uninvited guests trashed their living room, frightening the owner to death and making Angela weep bitterly. Her own home no longer seemed safe. And her husband, instead of being a poor support, yelled at her, demanding instead of crying that she figure out where to borrow money. From this turn, Angela became even more depressed, and her husband completely stopped paying attention to her, frantically searching for the necessary amount of money. They sold the entire car, the furniture, the gold jewelry. Her furious husband even forced her to pawn her mother's ring, which he'd given them on their wedding day as a family heirloom. But it still wasn't enough. One night, the bandits returned to their already so tattered house, only they didn't threaten them anymore. Silently, they took the money, which covered half of the amount named at the beginning, and then silently they also killed William right in front of Angela. The woman cried desperately and begged the thugs to stop. But they indifferently poured gasoline over the man, who was already dead, and then spilled the flammable liquid all over the room. Angela watched in a daze as the strangers in black masks destroyed what little was still dear to her heart, not even trying to stop them, knowing that her strength was barely enough just to get to her feet. In that moment, she felt completely devastated, helpless and unwanted by anyone. At one point, the bandits shoved a gun at her for some reason, made her squeeze something in her fingers. Then they took it away and put it in her pocket. Then they dragged her outside and set the place on fire. Angela just sat on the ground and cried silently, saying goodbye to what had once been her whole life. 15 minutes later, the sirens of a police patrol could be heard behind her. But instead of calming the poor woman down, the human rights defenders immediately threw her to the ground, picked up her gun, and cuffed her hands behind her back. Lying on the cold ground, the woman tried to explain something through her sobs, but no one gave her a chance to speak. The cops were happy to have such a killer in the face of a weak, crying woman. Here's the motive. The investigator dropped the file on the table a few days later. And here was the culprit. Angela sat in a hard chair in an office with a dim lamp. She hadn't been interrogated much before. Held in a holding cell. What was the motive? Angela whispered in front of your uncracked lips. Money, my dear, as always. Money. Shook his head, the man in the blue uniform some weeks before the murder. All the funds from your company's accounts, from personal accounts, were collected in one place. Only you had legal access, and your trembling spouse, who left our sinful world untimely, not without your help. What kind of nonsense is that? Yes, we were collecting money to pay off murderers. Angela couldn't take it anymore. You're the only murderer here, my dear. And apparently your husband couldn't pay you off. William was shot with the gun that was taken from your custody. They also found an empty gas can and a lighter with your prints on it. They planted it on me. I don't even know how to shoot. You know how many times somebody said that around here? The investigator grinned. Forensics already found out that the bullet fired from that particular gun was the root cause of William's death. We were lucky it pierced his heart and lodged in his spine, which allowed us to run the necessary tests quickly. What can I say? The barrel of the gun that was pulled out of your hand still smelled like gunpowder. At the time of the arrest, the house had burned to the ground. I'm sure there would have been more evidence at the murder scene. Well, that's a great idea about the arson, isn't it? I'll say. The wooden house was on fire like a candle. After this interrogation, there were several more where they offered to sign confessions. But the woman withdrew into herself and remained silent, without giving answers to questions. They even brought her to the scene of the fire as an investigative experiment, but all they got was another tantrum. The tormented psyche could not endure having received confirmation that only a heap of coal was left of the past life. However, the investigation was over fast. Angela, remember, did not have time to be on the bench. Orphaned mother passed away recently, and to protect the poor girl was simply no one. There was not even a good lawyer to hire. The husband stipulated all the bills, trying to pay off the terrible guests. There was nothing much to take, but even these supplies were emptied to the last. The couple did not have time to have children. That is why Angela did not have a single extenuating circumstance. Prison was not easy. Angela felt completely unprepared for the new conditions of life in the women's colony. She was used to the freedom of independence, and now her actions were restricted everywhere by brutal rules controlling her every move. The situation was made worse by a sense of monstrous injustice. After all, she had done nothing to deserve such a thing. Yet no one believed the unhappy woman or even considered it necessary to listen to her pleas. Every day was a trial for Angela, forcing her to overcome many difficulties. She felt really lonely and isolated because others did not accept her, not even wanting to communicate with the strange stove. Angela tried to look strong, not to show weakness. But sometimes emotions again took over reason, and then she drowned in the feeling of loneliness even more, unable to cope with her fears. So passed 4 years, and then the warden of the penal colony, a local landlord who had long considered the state institution his property, came into her life. He was a man of medium height, but his physique betrayed a commitment to sports. Stocky, austere, with a man for the correction of criminals. The boss, as all the staff called him behind his back, offered Angela the chance to be a maid in his house on account of serving her sentence. He would never have made such an offer to an ordinary criminal, but he knew the story of the unlucky bunny, so he wasn't worried about the domestic woman going on the run. Probably some might say that Tom felt pity for the unfortunate woman, but the reason turned out to be much more prosaic. The new 3-story house really needed constant care. The demanding boss wanted his place to be sparkling clean, but did not like to clean it himself. And he did not want to pay a hired worker, and it was not easy to do without servants. And then Angela just so happened to come along. The work in the house didn't look so easy, but at least there were no other prisoners there, and the warden had promised. Buy normal groceries, not prison food. Well, will you work for me? Tom clarified, looking at the woman. Anything is better than sitting here, said Angela. You're good. Don't worry. If you behave yourself, no one will hurt you. You won't notice how long you'll serve, and then you'll get a job. What's the deal? The warden, in fact, turned out to be not a bad person. Angela's new duties included cleaning and housekeeping. Nothing too fancy. Angela quickly adjusted to the daily routine and did a pretty good job with all the errands. Tom was pleased with his acquisition, from time to time tossing her bonuses in the form of delicacies from his own supply. The days flew by one after another. It would have been all right, but the boss's son, Jacob, turned out to be quite a ladies' man. He immediately laid his eyes on the modest but beautiful Angela, determined to seduce her into intimacy. Once again, Jacob was returning from a party joined by the Society of Corrupt Women. Love for money had long bored the young slacker, and his gaze caught on Angela again. Strangely beautiful in her modesty, the woman had always tried to be kind and sympathetic. What was it that displaced his interest even more? She glowed at home in her simple outfit and smiled sweetly, not even aware that the guy was paying such close attention to her, working as hard as ever. That's who you should have invited to tonight's party, Jacob pronounced, looking at Angela. I don't think that would have been appropriate, she replied, smiling. It's true. You're too sweet and kind for the tangle of snakes that usually gathers there, the boy pronounced, looking his companion straight in the eye. Angela only modestly sunk. She was already accustomed to this kind of treatment. Although what to hide, the courtesy was very pleasant to her. By the way, I've noticed that you sometimes borrow books from our library. I just read, Angela worried. Don't worry about it. It's just that I'm interested in it too. Thought we could talk about our favorite authors sometime. Angela was a little confused, but the landlord's son seemed like a perfectly decent, respectable man who wanted to be trusted. They chatted some more. That evening, discussing books, music, and other things that had long ago left the life of a woman, it was nice to find such an educated interlocutor. And Angela involuntarily felt that she was developing a liking for Jacob. I really like your company, the guy finally said. Maybe we could go out. I don't think Tom would let me leave the house. You know that. I know, interrupted Jacob. Didn't mean a serious adventure. Just a walk in our garden. Let's walk down the paths to the summer house. They spent a few more hours together, drank wine, and then Angela didn't notice how she ended up in bed with the ardent young man. The modesty and propriety inherent in her somehow gave way. But as so often happens, the sympathy was short-lived, getting its own way. Jacob stopped paying attention to her with no remorse whatsoever. Despite the fact that Angela had awakened some feelings for the boy, she knew that it had been a mistake. She shouldn't have succumbed to his sweet talk, much less lost her head so much. She resolved never to act so recklessly again. But she soon learned that their casual liaison had borne fruit. Or rather, fruit. I mean, not on purpose, Tom said angrily, looking at his son. She was just walking tripped, found herself pregnant or something. The landlord roared again. You little prick. You're not enough chicks around. You had to go to this one. I do not want to listen to anything. I'll keep you for a month without pay. You'll be on a diet. Maybe you'll learn to appreciate the luxury that was available. After giving his son a scolding, the warden decided to hush up the case. Quickly, I must see the point before his belly became very prominent. After getting her to sign the necessary papers, Tom returned the woman to the colony and soon afterwards drove her out of his life on all fours. That's how the saint lived to this day. Bitter recollections made. The tears treacherously spurt from her eyes. She sat down on the bus-stop bench, genuinely unable to understand why the world around her had treated her so cruelly. Pregnant and no one wants her. Of course, some might say it was Angela's own fault. Giving in, apparently, to an unfortunate infatuation. But it's one thing to be wise, looking at other people's mistakes, and quite another to build your own life. Relieved, Angela searched her pockets, trying to figure out how much money she had left. It came out very little. Barely enough to get from the colony to the nearest town. Of course, she could try to hitch a ride, but it was almost impossible to catch a car passing by in these parts. In addition, drivers were reluctant to pick up the exempts, more and more driving by. Angela continued to sit at the abandoned bus stop, realizing that there probably wouldn't be a bus until the evening. She was already 2 months pregnant. And sitting on a chilly bench was not at all comfortable. In addition, there was an unpleasant smell coming from the nearby garbage can. At least the wind blew it away a little. At the same time, the woman's short hair. Trying to protect herself from the autumn chill, the nausea kicked in again. The longer the pregnancy lasted, the more often the woman felt all the charms. Now she wished she had brought some water with her. She had to concentrate on her own breathing to distract herself from the unpleasant sensations. The wind kept picking up. Angela bit her lip so she wouldn't start crying again. Now it seemed to her that the bus would never come and she would have to spend the rest of her life on that cold, forgotten bench. When despair reached its peak and the woman was ready to walk toward town, a small figure finally appeared in the distance. A yellow bus was creeping leisurely along the broken highway in the vicinity. Nodding with Angela's dim headlights, he waved his hand, attracting the driver's attention. He squinted unfriendly at her with apparent reluctance, stopping his transport. "Is that enough to get you into town?" the woman asked, holding out the remaining bills. "Just as far as the outskirts. At least that," she replied, handing over the money. Angela settled down on the shabby seat, wishing she were at least a little warmer in the tobacco. Smelling interior, the heater barely worked, blowing warm air. But it was better than forging on the side of the road. "Everybody's here," the chauffeur rudely called out, dozing into his passenger. The driver kept his promise, bringing her to the suburban station. It was still a long way from here to civilization, but at least there were some houses in sight. At the very least, she could get there on foot. I didn't want to go outside, but I had no choice, Angela thought. Tucking her hands into the sleeves of her coat, she jumped off the bus steps. Now she had to catch a ride again. Maybe the drivers would be more cooperative here. The woman looked into the distance, but as luck would have it, the road was empty again. About half an hour passed. No one stopped to give her a ride, or at least talk to her. The rare cars whizzed by at high speed, paying no attention to the lone figure. "What kind of punishment is this?" Angela murmured, already desperate. She shuddered. A full day in the fresh air was by no means doing her any good, more out of inertia than actually keeping her hope alive. She waved, and to the passing off-road cars braking, she suddenly threw her headlights at them. "I can't believe my eyes," Angela thought. She walked to the driver's door, waiting patiently for the tinted windows to come down. "Hello," she said as the driver opened the window from the driver's seat. "I was looking at her," pronounced the woman, dressed in a white terrycloth robe. She was beautiful, except that the mascara wasn't neatly smeared under her eyes, which were filled with tears. Her black hair was gathered into a ponytail that had partially disintegrated on her shoulders. The woman sat behind the wheel of the car, nervously clutching the steering wheel with her fingers beside it. In the back seat sat a child, a boy about 5 or 6 years old, who clearly did not understand why his mother was crying. His small hands were hugging a soft toy. The child was unusually quiet, overwhelmed by the tension built up in the car. "Get in, I'll take you where you need to go," pronounced the stranger in a voice that sounded lean. "I have nowhere to be in a hurry, so take advantage." Angela didn't know what to say. For one thing, standing outside was boring. It was getting late in the evening, and dusk was beginning to gather in the sky. Staying alone on the night road was not a good idea, but, on the other hand, there was evidently something wrong with the woman, and it was not clear whether she should interfere in this trouble. Stepped from foot to foot. Her gaze returned to the boy. She looked more closely and almost gasped. The boy was still clutching a soft toy. He was a mini copy of his late father. The woman remembered looking through her husband's family album and came across a picture of him from kindergarten. The same features, the same eyebrow shape and eye color. The coincidence was too amazing to just dismiss it. "Did something happen to you?" Angela finally spoke up, looking shyly at the boy's mother. "Sit down if you want to chat," the woman replied. "It's actually forbidden to stand here for long." Angela walked around the car and settled into the passenger seat. The SUV started up and they leisurely drove toward town, finding the nearest coffee shop. It turned out that Veronica, the name of the unexpected companion, had divorced her husband. "The bastard left him for his mistress," she recounted. "Acted like a bastard, leaving a single mother with a child in her arms and without financial support. Moreover, the hubby somehow managed to take out a loan on Veronica for a huge amount, which the woman will have to pay for decades. I gave birth to his son, and he did this like a real pig," exclaimed Veronica. The woman could hardly hold back her tears as she recounted her husband's betrayal, and Angela felt her heart almost regret the same pain and betrayal. She sympathized sincerely. New acquaintance, and throughout the conversation, tried to support the poor girl. After all, her own wounds kept her from forgetting that she had been in the same situation. Angela knew that even the humblest, comforting remark could be wrong, sarcastic. She wanted to help Veronica and tell her how she herself had been through a difficult time, but she knew that by doing so she might inadvertently hurt her even more. So Angela just sat quietly, keeping close to Veronica, waiting for her to pour out all the accumulated pain. The most important thing now was to let her know that the woman was not alone in her suffering, and that Angela would be with her all the way. Nothing could be changed now. No one could bring her ex-husband back or resolve the conflict, but there could be a shoulder to lean on that would be a modern support. It was a long time before the casual confession came to its conclusion. Veronica dropped Angela off in town near a cheap hotel where she could spend the night. Life went on as usual. The ex-con managed to find quite a decent job and even rented a room in a nice dormitory, though it was far from luxurious. a little hole where she could hide from the hustle and bustle of the day for a while. But it was far better than the prison casemates and sweetly leafy rooms of the master and his son's mansion. As it happened, Angela continued to have occasional conversations with Veronica. Even that night, the women exchanged numbers and called each other occasionally, without any intention, just to chat. One day, they agreed to meet at the same coffee shop to talk about their women's business again. "Man, can you believe I haven't deleted all the pictures yet?" Veronica pronounced, looking at her phone screen. After looking at the smug face, Angela looked at the smartphone without much desire and almost dropped her cup of coffee out of her hand. Staring directly at her from the picture was her ex-husband, whom she had thought was dead all this time. "It can't be," Angela muttered. But Veronica was already fully immersed in her own thoughts, figuring out how much time had passed since the breakup and the boy's age. Well, yeah, that's right. It all adds up. Somehow the ex-husband had managed to go to the other side of the world and then get married and make a baby to another woman. And all this while, Angela was in prison for his alleged murder. Could it be that the scoundrel had managed to cheat 2 women? And now he started dragging a 3rd woman into his web. "You and I, it turns out, are sisters in misfortune," Angela brooded. "What else?" Veronica asked irritably. Angela went into a leisurely story about her bitter fate. She did not embellish the facts, but did not soften the terrible events. It was her turn to share the pain, of which her new friend was not even aware. The woman's speech flowed peacefully. But the further the story went, the paler her friend grew. "How so?" stammering Veronica interrogated. She was clearly in shock. It was one thing to hear about such stories from the news or watch a movie, and quite another to see right in front of her the protagonist of such an adventure. And the worst thing was that in place of Angela was herself. If the cunning scam pleased Mujenko so much that he would dare to repeat it again. "We mustn't just leave it like this," Veronica said firmly. "Yes. And what can we do?" grinned Angela. Years in the colony had long ago extinguished the fighting spirit in her. The woman didn't fall down, but she had long ago learned to avoid unnecessary trouble lest she get even more hurt. In a pursuit of feeling, she had learned to let go of the past. "Let's go to the police. Report fraud. The police here aren't used to working. They only give them ready suspects on whom they can hang the solving of the case right away." The memories of her own experience made her shiver. The woman knew firsthand that the law enforcement officers would not even listen to them. "Look, we mustn't give up, okay?" Veronica whispered, looking into her friend's eyes. "It's not just about justice, is it? We have to clear your name. Otherwise, everyone will still think that you are a murderer." Her new friend's words touched a nerve. Angela felt a tiny spark of hope somewhere deep in her soul, hope to get her life back. "Where do we start?" It took them a few days to prepare thoroughly. Veronica scoured the internet for legislation and wrote out everything that suited their case. At the same time, she studied the ways they could be rejected just to avoid starting complicated investigations and thought in advance how to avoid such a turn. Angela, in turn, tried to recall all the details of their plausible life. What acquaintances did he have? Where did the man like to go most often? And what places from the past did he mention? Finally, having gathered everything they needed in a single file of documents, the women went to the nearest police station, where they were not expected to believe them. "Believe me, this is the last place I'd come to dispel everyday boredom," Angela muttered. "And yet you're standing in front of me telling tall tales," the investigator brushed off. "These are not tall tales?" "You!" Veronica shouted, shaking the file folder. "If you want, leave a statement or get out of here. Don't get in the way of doing real work." "Come on! We can't get any help here!" Veronica shouted. "The ladies have watched more detectives." Raised an eyebrow at the man on duty. The man looked frankly repulsive. His skin was rough and pale, as if he hadn't seen the sun in years. They had managed to get down to the first floor and almost out of the police building when they heard hurried footsteps behind them. "Wait," came the voice of the hotel porter. The young officer leveled with them, panting heavily after running. "What do you want?" asked the ex-convict. "Here." The officer held out a small piece of paper with a few lines on it, a phone number and Dustin's name. "This is my mentor, a real old-school police officer. He handles cases like this. Sorry, I overheard you. I knew this investigator of ours couldn't help you. Dustin will figure it out." "And why would he?" asked Angela dryly. Starting life, she was in no hurry to trust cops, even if they seemed quite friendly. Each of those who came her way had, at one time or another, pursued their own goals and interests. Those were not always righteous. "You know, people are used to us not caring about them," the young officer pronounced after a short pause. "For the most part, we do. It's impossible to work in today's system. But that doesn't mean we're all such bastards. Call Dustin, at least just tell him what's going on. He'll help." "Thank you," Veronica said. Climbing out from behind Angela's shoulder, the woman herself did not notice how she instinctively shielded her new friend with herself, not wanting her to have any contact with these people. "We'll think about it." Angela took the piece of paper. It took Veronica a lot of effort and time to convince her friend to call the number. Angela, once again faced with the indifference of investigators, flatly refused to return to this option, offering to forget about their little crusade. Veronica, on the other hand, encouraged the young officer with her speech. In the end, she convinced a friend of horoscopes on the internet to read some articles about this mysterious Dustin. The policeman was known as a man who always stood up for justice. When he listened to their story and realized that the women had fallen for a con man who had not only forced them to marry him, but had set them up for trial, his heart raced with a sense of indignation. He decided to take up the investigation. Don't waste time in unnecessary reflection. The first thing Dustin did was to concentrate on finding out everything he could about Angela and the details of the prosecution. He went through old papers and traced the actions taken by his colleagues. In this way, the man hoped to trace the connection to the original mastermind of the frame-up, and perhaps expose investigators who were greedy for other people's money. The policeman decided to proceed cautiously so as not to set Angela up. He used his detective skills and identified the places the crook visited to meet with other criminals and some people in his entourage. In the end, the effort was not in vain, and Dustin was able to find out for sure that William was alive and well and still in town, continuing to pull off his dirty machinations. Before long, the police officer was able to gather enough evidence against the ex-husband and then quickly cut him off from cooperating with criminal gangs and his social circles. Investigators had no choice but to open a case against the crook who had brought grief to so many innocent women. And Dustin impressed everyone with his skills and successful work. Not for a moment did not miss the course of further investigation, so that the scoundrel is not off the hook. Finally, after a long trial, William was sent to prison, and the women were relieved of the need to pay unsustainable loan. "So, that's how it works," said Dustin. As it turned out, he was changing his last names, taking them from new women in order to throw the cops off the trail. "Exactly. I was so surprised when he decided to take mine." Veronica shook her head. "So was I." Angela sadly remembered the time when she had been very young and naive. Back then, she had not even suspected her husband, unconditionally believing in the infallibility of his love. How could she have failed to notice all his grimaces and shenanigans? How blinded by feelings did she have to be? What to say? The swindler and con artist had only once slipped up and left a child for Veronica, so to speak. The genetic examination proved his involvement at the very least. In this scam, Dustin continued the story. His murder, by the way, was staged 5 or 6 years ago, as he cunningly bought the corpse of some homeless poor guy in the morgue, all to make Angela believe he was dead. "Why?" she asked. "It's simple. You were grief-stricken and did not even try to think logically. You'll pardon my bluntness. and you thought you were set up by some unknown bandits and did not even try to suspect the true director of this performance. Damn was the only answer Angela could give. Indeed, all these years she had not even guessed that her own husband had led her around the finger. No, of course, she thought his action with the loan was ugly, but at least he justified his desire to pay off the bandits. The reality turned out to be much more unsightly. Okay, now, it's all good. The real culprits are found. The villains are punished and the beautiful princesses are saved. Well done, grinned the policeman. That concludes my credentials, so allow me to divert. The man got up from the table of his favorite coffee shop, bowed to his girlfriends, playfully trumped them, and left the establishment. Angela looked thoughtfully at her savior, not completely believing that they had won after all. Yes, I agree. The gate is nice, she asked. Yes, look closely, look closely. He's a good-looking man, and he's single. Veronica giggled. How do you know? Angela wondered, still in her thoughts. Asked him, you know. He's a detective, she added. What are we even talking about? Angela perked up, finally realizing that they were discussing the fate of their settled Dustin. But don't be silly either. And that all the investigations he was hanging around you, wooing, comforting, supportive. And how valiantly did you catch that bastard? Veronica interrupted her. Oh, it's amazing. Get off. Angela shrugged off her friend's taunts with embarrassment. She herself noticed the policeman's attention, which was slightly out of line with polite interest. Besides, Dustin turned out to be a handsome man in the prime of his life. He was a real hero with a face expressing strong character, manly cheekbones, deep brown eyes, and a high forehead that gave his face a certain austerity. His hair was short, dark, and his eyebrows were above average size. The man often smiled, but his smile was unusually serious, and often his face expressed deep concentration. The policeman's physique was athletic. He looked very healthy. His overall appearance was attractive and imposing, which made people feel safe around him. So did Angela, though she inwardly resisted her strained sympathy for the lawman. For her, this love was too forbidden, as if a woman were betraying her principles. Life went on as it was. The unfortunate sisters kept in touch, and their companionship had long ago grown into a firm friendship. Angela gave birth to twins. Veronica, like a true friend, helped in everything, supporting her. All was well in the new life. The women even began to believe that they had finally managed to turn over a new leaf and start life over again. Suddenly, the unexpected happened. Veronica ended up in the hospital. It all started with a simple ailment to which she did not pay attention. Tiredness, dizziness. Who doesn't? Single motherhood and work wear anyone out, Veronica thought. There will be a vacation, there I will rest, she said, waving off any suggestions to visit the doctor. In the end, an unknown disease knocked the cheerful Veronica off her feet. Angela would not leave her bedside, thinking that her sister's health had been interrupted by nerves. Her friend would never admit it. But the divorce and subsequent trial had not been easy for her at all. It would not have been surprising if she had been so stressed that she had felt depressed. But now the doctors are sneakily melting away. Her body is shaken. After all, modern medicine sometimes works miracles. But the miracle didn't happen. After finishing all sorts of tests, the specialist made a disappointing diagnosis. Cancer? It's okay, we mustn't give up. Remember? Barely holding back tears, Angela uttered. I don't know if I can. Her friend smiled weakly. So don't give me those pessimistic moods, Angela said. Everything will work out, she said cheerfully, counting how much money she had left in her stash. In the short time she had been working, she had managed to put some away, but all that money still wasn't enough. The experimental treatment had sucked up resources. It helped alleviate her symptoms a little. Doctor said there was a chance. With trembling lips, Angela whispered, Come on, I'm not stupid, Veronica replied. The ex-prisoner turned away to the window so as not to show her tears. Seeing her beloved friend in such a state was beyond her strength. For the umpteenth time she had lost a loved one. For the umpteenth time an indelible scar was left on her soul. Angela felt hopeless pain, watching as her sister burned with the cursed disease. 6 months they had fought, 6 months of sleepless nights instead of any hope left. Only sorrow and sadness filled her heart. The realization that Veronica was leaving her life and would never share her everyday life and would never share her everyday life again made her shudder. Angela felt she didn't have enough time to say everything she felt about her friend, and that made her longing even worse. Don't be sad. It will pass. I want you to remember us happy. Veronica smiled from a corner. You know, death is a good excuse to remember how precious life is. You are such a philosopher, said Angela sadly. Thank you. For what? For the relationship we had and the time we spent together. Angela smiled, but there were still tears in her eyes. Her friend bravely batted with all her appearance, showing that all was well. But they both knew that this might be their last meeting. One thing I want to ask you, said Veronica suddenly, after a short silence. Take care of your son. Angela looked at her, painfully biting her lower lip. There was no need to answer because she had done it without asking, not allowing the boy to end up in an orphanage. But the mother needed confirmation. So she nodded, reassuring Veronica. It's all up to you. Swear you won't leave him. I swear. Angela squeezed her fingers together, her friend sealing her oath with a warm touch. A short time later, Veronica was gone. Angela ended up being a young mother with 3 children and a mass of uncertainty. Ahead, she knew that little lives depended entirely on her, so she couldn't afford to lose this struggle. For the past month, Angela had felt an oppressive feeling, a lack of money, and the need to cope with many tasks, including caring for the little ones and paying the bills. She felt stressed, tired, but she couldn't afford to rest. Someone had to provide for their small family's livelihood. Angela sent out job applications every day, but the emails were still empty. Employers were in no hurry to hire a woman with no experience and with a questionable past. And when she finally received an answer, she immediately accepted without hesitation, even though the vacancy for a cleaner at a private firm did not look presentable. But it was at least some income. Angela worked with tenacity, completing all her assignments. Every day she was busy working, giving the children under the supervision of a neighbor who for a small fee agreed to be a babysitter for 3 kids. However, the excitement and problems were not getting any smaller. The young mother had no idea how to solve them. It seemed to her that life was still too complicated and unpredictable. But every night when she returned home, she saw her smiling children and realized that this is what really matters in life. All these worries and turmoil were only worries, and turmoil were only temporary. Things were bound to get better. Angela knew it would not be easy, but life is always a challenge to get through. Where to get the uniforms and textbooks to buy now? Angela muttered, wiping away any residual moisture with a dry mop. Autumn was approaching, and for Veronica's son this year would be his first year of school. School brought with it not only new experiences, but also additional costs, which the modest family budget could hardly afford. And then there was the unpleasantness of the company. As soon as she got a job as a cleaner, she was already anticipating problems in the team. The woman understood that if she came in last, she would be made a laughingstock among the others, especially in a low-paying job. But what awaited Angela next exceeded all her expectations. Once down on the first floor, she set about mopping the floors as usual. But she heard giggles and whispers from her co-workers. Look, a murderer. The snide hisses resounded. Angela knew the reason for the taunts, though no one on the staff was in the field of justice themselves. Strange taunts from her colleagues, which echoed painfully in her soul, made Angela's blood boil. As soon as she felt everyone's eyes on her, she realized that life was not going to work out the way she wanted it to at all. It seemed she would have to fight daily against this insane collective antipathy. Angela began to look for a way out of this situation, but could not think of any solution that would protect her forever from these constant attacks. In general, the adaptation to the new work was long and painful, but Angela held on as she could, not paying attention to the evil tongues of the office dwellers, hoping that one day the attitude to her would change. And indeed, after a couple of months, she noticed that in the office strange things began to happen that in no way related to her person. One day she heard some talk about the firm's owner being an elderly man who was in trouble and her son was ready to sell his firm. Generous partners, competitors, were willing to offer an excellent price, such that the young offspring would have enough for the rest of his life, even if he spent every day in endless carousing. The news was grim and reeked of outright betrayal. Angela did not like the mood flying in the air at once. The new management, the changing order, and let the cleaning lady did not take part in the life of the office. Still, she had a restless feeling. After a while, Angela noticed even more remarkable things. For example, the fact that many of the employees began to support the idea, emphasizing that it was due to the difficult economic situation and the inevitable, say, the company. The director's son not only decided to sell the company, but also began actively fostering scary rumors to undermine team cohesion. No one noticed a simple cleaning lady, and so they boldly spoke directly in her presence. After a while, it became clear that a revolt was brewing not only among the managers, but also among the management, whose members decided to take advantage of the hype and also take a piece of the delicious pie. It seems that something has to be done. Angela let it slip, once again witnessing a secret battle in the office kitchen. That same day, she tried to convey her view of what was going on to her boss, but too busy director politely refused to see her, not even letting her on the threshold of his office. Nevertheless, the attempt should have counted. Conscience could no longer reproach Angela for inaction. It was worth it just to forget about the intrigues of the rich and do her little business. But one day Angela overheard a conversation that finally set the record straight. I have a meeting soon with our partners. They asked me to bring them copies of our financial documents to look for dubious transactions and get another leverage on the old man. The son of the director of the company said smugly. He always does his business honestly. His interlocutor stretched out doubtfully. He does, and how to do business through the accounts of our office. I'll even put all these transfers in one file on purpose, to make it easier for my colleagues to figure it out. Pops always signs documents for me without looking, believes like himself. Angela held her breath and listened to the haughty conversation. On a hunch, she took her phone out of her pocket and began to write down everything they were discussing. The next morning, the indifferent woman was waiting for her boss, along with the recording. Hello again, the man wearily stretched out. Edward, I won't take up much of your time. Just trust me. You need to listen to this. She held out her phone, showing the recording from the day before. Hearing the familiar voices, the director frowned disapprovingly at first. The cleaning lady is eavesdropping on the managers. But the longer his son's words shook the air, the more his expression changed in the office. Once inside, Angela modestly took a seat in the visitor's chair, placing the phone in her boss's hands. The company director listened to the tape to the end, understanding more from the many words than the women who do not know the business. What treachery! He was ready to bring his son and the other perpetrators to justice even now. But the next day, he was in the hospital with severe poisoning. Angela was sure it had to do with a conspiracy by her son and his gang. But she was powerless. To prove this coincidence, of course, seemed too obvious. But the investigators needed something substantial, not speculation. A few days later, word reached Angela that Edward's son was finally ready to sell the firm. She was offended. After all, despite her best efforts to prevent an insidious plan fail, it remained to console herself with the fact that she had already done a lot, being a simple cleaner. The day of the signing of the ill-fated contract was inexorably approaching. There was no way to stop it. After all, the son had assumed full inheritance for the duration of his dear father's illness. His henchmen were rubbing their hands smugly, but at the most responsible moment, during the signing of the deal and the exchange of documents, Edward burst into the office. It turned out that the director had created the appearance of severe poisoning in order to establish who and why was conspiring against the company. The man wasted no time in finding evidence of the guilt of employees, including his own son, who had created the desired impression of the firm by pushing the idea that it should be sold. Before the remaining founders, the director finally realized that the entire conspiracy was artificial and driven by his son's desire for easy profits without putting any effort into running the empire he had created. The executives, along with their team, decided to continue operations, and despite all obstacles, the firm successfully overcame the crisis created around it. Angela was glad that everything worked out well and that she was able to help her team. The woman realized that it was necessary to be always on the alert and not to keep silent, even if you occupy a completely non-substantial position. In the end, it was a good lesson for her, as it was for all her colleagues, who remained faithful to their leader. "Come in," coming cordially. Edward opened the office door. He invited Angela in to thank her properly for her help. "I'm sorry I didn't hear you right away. There was so much to take care of. Who knew all this trouble came from that good? For nothing. That's all right. The main thing is that everything ended well." Angela smiled embarrassedly. "Well, thank you. The company won't forget your efforts. I'll be sure to find you a better position," the man said, taking a small velvet box out of a drawer. Then he placed it right in front of Angela. "I noticed that you always wear that pendant. Beautiful, no argument. But such a pretty girl should have more jewelry." The principal smiled softly. "I took the liberty of choosing a necklace for you. Don't get me wrong, just a thank you gift." "Thank you," she thanked heartily. "I am pleased by such attention, and I will accept it so as not to offend you. But I wear this locket for a reason." Angela's fingers touched the round ornament, searching for a small button. A click was heard, and Angela saw 2 photographs secured in the half of the locket. One was Veronica, the sister who had left her quite recently, and the other was a young woman who looked a little like Angela herself. "Who is that?" asked Edward in a trembling voice, looking at the picture. "My mother. I carry it as a memento. Unfortunately, she is no longer with us." "But mentally," replied Angela. The principal was shocked to see the picture. It turned out that he had once been in love with her and even made plans for their future together. But fate had separated the 2 loving hearts and never allowed them to reunite in the raging sea of life. "So you are my daughter," muttered Edward. "What?" Angela responded incomprehensibly. The principal talked about her past, about how they first met her mother, and how their lives might have turned out. They talked for hours, recounting their adventures. A DNA test only confirmed the man's hunch, proving their direct kinship. After such a wonderful reunion, Edward invited his daughter to live with him in the same house, and the news of 3 grandchildren brought even more joy to the soulful host. Angela was happy, though it was strange to meet her father and learn about her mother's past. She was pleasantly surprised by the warm welcome of Edward's family, who tried to take the new relative under their own roof as soon as possible. And after a while, there was a man who was ready to protect her from any adversity. Dustin, the policeman who once helped justify her name, eventually became her husband, finding an approach even to such a difficult heart as Angela's. The man adopted all of her children, and they all began to live together, surrounding each other with love. If you like this story, I hope for your support with the thumbs up button. It's just one click for you, but it's extremely important to me. Thank you in advance and goodbye.